Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar tonight. My name is Alan Pedersen. I'm the Executive Director of the Compassionate Friends, and we bring you these webinars on a regular basis so that we can help you in your grief. I have two wonderful partners on the call with me today, Dr. Gloria Horsley and Dr. Heidi Horsley. Interesting topic today, men, women, and grief. And so we have a really good guest, Glen Kelley, who speaks and is an author and talks a lot about this subject.
I also wanted to say a few things about Ron because he's got so much he's done in this field, and he serves on the board of directors for the Bereaved Parents of the USA. He's appeared on Trinity Broadcast Network, CBS News, and multiple radio programs, and he was honored as the keynote speaker at the headquarters of Delta Airlines in March before a national fly-in of grieving employees who have lost children.
Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Oh, it was. It's so rewarding. It's a gift that we wish that we didn't have, but it's one of the gifts I think Jonathan left behind was to go forth and walk with other people down their journey. And it heals me as much as it heals anybody else. So thank you for that. That was quite an honor that I got.
Well, talk a little bit about Jonathan.
Oh, Jonathan was my pride and joy. Born in '97 with a condition known as hypoplastic left heart syndrome. So he came into the world with half a heart. And the day he was born, they handed him to me and said he won't make it through the night. But he had different plans, along with his creator. He died at the age of 16 as complications from that heart condition. However, he was not supposed to, so it wasn't an expected thing. He had a wonderful surgeon. It was a very rare heart condition. Jonathan spent his life under so much research. He actually lived with half a heart. They built his heart so it functioned as a full two-chamber heart, but almost as well as a four-chamber. It was tough for us. He went through a series of open heart surgeries before he was even 2.5. He submitted to 3 open heart surgeries to rebuild his heart. It was all rare. We were blessed to find a surgeon who said, I want to try. A few years before he was born, they would have handed him to us and said, enjoy what little time you have because you're not going to have him long.
You know, you make a good point with this. Really, we never think people are going to die, our kids, because there's so many things. So many treatments. We always hold out hope until that last moment, I do believe.
Absolutely. You'll find that even in palliative care patients, even their loved ones who are sitting around knowing that there's a possibility, always hope, always, there's always a hope that something is just, they're wrong. They're wrong. Cancer patients, people with hospice, us as supporters, we always sit around and hope that maybe by the grace of the Creator that this isn't right.
How did you decide to get into this men and grief thing? I know you've written a couple of books on it, right?
I have, and really it was because I had such a hard time finding support for myself out there as a man. And that doesn't mean clinicians. That means that much like a man, I went out there and tried to find a manual like I would find for my '69 Chevelle on how to rebuild it. I couldn't find one on men. So, the last couple of years after I left a career in law enforcement, I was writing proposals in the defense industry and making other people a lot of money. So as I started to discover some of the things that I did about myself and about men and about women, I thought, instead of doing this for somebody to go out and make a profit off of it, let's see if I can write and I can help other people. And it's been led down that path.
How many books have you written?
I've got 3 out there now. The first 2 are really more focused on really ways to discover yourself. And if I can make a keynote about any of my writings, the biggest thing is that you don't really need to change. You just need awareness and understanding of yourself and your partner. If we can just understand that they are not us, then we're not going to be upset with them and they're not going to be upset with us if we make them aware of this is who I am. I don't want guys to think that any of my publications say that you must start breaking down and crying. If you're not, it's not who you are. Those times during that really early stressor of grief is not a time to look at yourself. Even if you feel unfavorable about the way that you respond, it's a bad time to look at yourself and say, I don't like who I am. Do that later in life.
On behalf of all of us men who work out in the grief world, I want to thank you for taking on this topic because a lot of us, I get it that there are people who stick their, hands into a beehive. I get that. There's people that do that. And I've always thought to myself, I get that they do it. I don't know why. And then you took on this subject for us. So I'm very glad that you did because it's difficult when you're working with grieving families and you're a grieving person yourself.
Right.
We are different, men. We just want to fix it, like you said, and then we can't fix ourselves. We can't fix our wives, our kids, or whatever, the barking dog next door. So I honor you for taking on this subject, and I think hopefully people are going to learn a lot today about the tolerance that we can give to each other when we're grieving as couples.
I am humbled by what you said, but when you said beehive, then I want to throw that right back at you, because in Scottsdale, I was thrown in the middle of the women's only session, and that was a beehive. Is a man sitting in front of an entire room full of women going, "What is my man thinking? What's on his mind?" In a nutshell, it's almost, there are many more along the same level as that, but it's the stoicism, it's the internal grieving versus the external as a female. It's the really, and I even had some, did he love the child as much as me? But a lot of it was more along the lines, and keep in mind, and I want people to know this, and I'm sure Alan, everybody does, about the conferences, is they're not deep, dark sessions. There was actually quite a bit of humor in the women that wanted to know what their men were thinking. But there were some of the darker ones where, I was wondering the whole time, and maybe that's best way to put it is they would mention, I wondered for the longest time if he really loved the child as much as I did, because he was not expressing his grief in the same manner I was. Do you follow?
Yeah, completely.
We hear that a lot, and I think one of the things, Ron, you probably encounter, and I do too, is I certainly, the audiences that come out to hear me speak and play music are overwhelmingly female. I would say, in my case, maybe 75%. But
Right.
One of the biggest draws, I think, is there's not a lot of men like ourselves who talk about this subject. We are different. Men are different. And there'll be a lot of times, and this probably happens to you too, where after an event, a woman will drag her husband up to me forcefully and, basically say, hey, Alan, I want you to tell my husband that he should go to support group meetings.
Right.
And I look at her and I say, no, I'm not going to tell your husband that he should go to support group meetings. Now, maybe that works for you. Maybe that's the best thing for you. But, that may not be the best thing for him. So I think, it's nobody's fault. We are different in how we grieve. If we can honor our differences, we can bring them together and we can help each other grieve. Just because we don't do it the same way doesn't mean we're doing it the wrong way.
As long as is your partner, whether it be your wife, whether it be your sister and a sibling kind of thing, whether it be a mother and a son and they've lost a father, as long as those two make each other aware, then it goes a long way to understanding.
One thing I want to say is I know there are people watching this webinar right now, and there are people who listen to our radio show, and there are people who visit us online who wouldn't even think about going to a grief group. They are women. So I want to say that you do get women who don't enjoy the group process too. We happen to see women who do, but there are women who don't. So there will be some people that will be watching this will say, that's not me, I'm not me. So, you have to look at who you are individually too. Are you a groupie kind of person? Do you like to go to groups and your spouse doesn't? There may be, we have guys in our Compassionate Friends chapter who their wives won't come.
Even though I am male, I might not be, I might have some femininity about me. I might cross over the gender neutral spot. I might be more feminine than I am a male counterpart of mine, somebody that's my peer. And you've got females that are going to be a little bit more masculine. And we talk about broad brushing. Fortunately, the vast majority of us are kind of middle of the road, either masculine or feminine, and we kind of fit into our sex, but not all of us. And that's what we have to tell people is we're all as unique as snowflakes and fingerprints.
Where you talk about we grieve on our own timeline, I'll have to say one thing. My thought about that is time is a factor. Time is one of the most stable factors as far as knowing how you will go through your grieving. Time does heal. It does not heal all wounds, but there are things that stop time, like lawsuits, anger, all sorts of things that I call them roadblocks in the way of having time, deal with it. And so I just wanted to say we grieve on our own timeline. I think that's true, but I think time can be a healing factor.
Sure, and I think, I'm preaching to the choir here, but what I tell people all the time is look for those things that show a person is now a danger to themselves in a way where, there is that lack of hygiene. There's an increase in alcoholism. Now they're getting into recreational drugs or something. But, other than that, if a person wants to lay in bed for the first month and just process it, then they're on their own timeline. And we're all going to grieve on our own timeline.
Yeah, I support that too. And I think when we start putting expectations, even on ourselves in grief, I think it's always important to have a goal and that I want to try to take a step forward. And even if that goal is just today, I'm going to get in the shower. It's good to have a goal every day. But I think that's what I actually like about support groups so much is that when you go to a support group, generally, especially if you're struggling and you think you're stuck in your grief or whatever, you'll see people that are farther down the road than you and some that aren't so far. And you'll look at the person farther down the road and you can see that, there's nothing that special necessarily about that person and they're making it. So maybe I can make it. But you'll also sometimes look at that newer person and you'll hear them speak and they'll start saying some things and you'll go, yeah, I remember when I was there and I'm not there now. And you can actually see yourself progressing where you think maybe you're not, but really you are when you start hearing and seeing that new face of grief that walks through the door. So I think it's important for people to take the pressure off, to take the clock away and the yardstick away and give yourself the space, and women and men. And that makes it difficult sometimes when you are moving at different paces as a couple, though. Sometimes that can make it difficult.
It's okay to take a break every now and then while you're grieving. And I tell people, if you think about this, if you really understand music itself, it's not just the notes in the music that make the beautiful song. It's also the rests in between the notes that make the beautiful song. So when you're going through your grief process and you feel like you're not moving forward, especially if you're sitting at a grief conference, guess what you're doing at that grief conference? You're moving forward, whether you're sitting there saying, I'm stuck. Well, you're not. You're moving forward, but it's okay to rest. Without that rest in between the notes, it would be a long note in a very ugly song. With that note, it's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? So it's okay to take the break.
What you're saying is even when you're taking a break, you're doing the work of grief.
Exactly. And
like
you're making the music. You're talking about men and women. Is this just about child loss? And I say, no, there's many relationships out there, especially if you lose your father and you are trying to deal with your mother's going to have just as difficult a time trying to understand you and you her as it would be a husband and wife trying to understand each other after child loss. It could be mother, son, brother, sister. There's a number of different relations out there in between men and women, and it doesn't have to be about
you know what's interesting about what you're saying, Ron? As you were discussing women's frustration with their spouses about not talking, I was like, oh my gosh, it sounds like the issues that parents have with their children. We don't communicate what's going on with us, and so parents are always saying, are you grieving?
Yeah, so it's not just that thing, okay, we're only talking about husbands and wives and the loss of a child. Everybody could benefit off of considering the differences in between men and women. There are many of those relationships out there. And then the second point that we talk about here is am I okay? And I think that should be, if not the first question, one of the first questions, because we all hear that so much. I'm not responding the way somebody else is. And it leads down the road to eventually questioning yourself. And unfortunately, sometimes, even in my case, questioning the love of my child. Did I love my child as much because I am not grieving in the same manner as other people who were as close to him as I was? That was kind of that catalyst for me where that's it. I'm done. If I'm questioning the love of my child, then I need to find out what's going on with me. But I got there. And I got there because I was watching my environment and the other people around me who were visibly more despondent than I was. So if we come out with an early question, am I okay? We go back to that part we talk about, are you doing anything to harm yourself? Are you grieving in your own timeline? Are you doing anything that would stop you from at least existing in life, not paying your bills, not doing things that somebody should be doing, right? And then along the lines of the second one, is my partner okay? You are the one that you think that you are doing it right, but you think your partner, there's something wrong with your partner. Did that partner love the child as much as he or she said? it all goes back to that, what we'll talk about throughout this, is that we're unique and we're different. Even in the same sex, we can be unique and different, but as a sex, we have a tendency to grieve in our own manners.
Part of it too, Ron, is that boys have been socialized, walk it off, suck it up, big boys don't cry, be a man. And they've been told from an early, the moment they're, hit the ground running, you are not allowed to show your emotions. It's not okay. And then when they have a death, we expect them to be all soft and emotional.
Right. And it's nurture. That's the difference between nature and nurture, and that's part of the nurturing. How did our role models, how was our environment after we were born shape us into who we are now? The good thing about that, while it's fundamental when you get in those childhood ages and go into teenage, that's not solid. We can change that. Some of the things that we might not be able to change so much as some of the things that we get from nature, and we'll talk about that too. But yeah, we're grown to be big boys don't cry, and then if you want to be on the football team, you have to be the toughest one out there as a man, and in order to get the pretty girl in the locker room or in the hallway, you got to be the biggest and toughest guy in school, and it goes farther than that. If you want to get in a good corporation and get up there, you've got to be able to be king of the hill. So yeah, as men, we're programmed to always be the aggressor and to hide our emotions.
There are some biological issues here too, because women produce some hormones that are much more likely to have women cry, and it's related to cortisol. So there are some physical things going on here too. Not that men don't cry, but there are some manifestations, I think, that fit into that.
And what I find that the most fascinating part about that, and I talk about the delivery system of the human body that is just dumping these chemicals into us faster than we could ever do with an IV bag. And these are subconscious reactions to things that are part of nature and nurture, and that nature part has been with us for thousands of years. Once your body dumps that cortisol, or once it drops anything into your system, it's automatic and it takes place faster than the conscious mind can react to it. And we have to be careful of that, especially when it dumps into the fight or flight system. We have a tendency to react to it quickly.
Now, I've got a question here from someone named Fred. He says that you talk about women cry more than men, but the reality is my wife is not crying and I am, and I'm wondering about that.
And again, he's perfectly fine the way he's doing, because we go back to not just the sex, but the gender issues. Gender is probably more environmental after you're born, and it molds you into who you're going to be as far as your feelings and how you're going to respond to things. And his gender could be a little bit more of what we would consider to be the feminine side. And that's not to insult anybody. It's just looking at research, and the feminine side, based on nature and nurture, is more likely to be more expressive, outwardly expressive in their emotions.
What did you do when you wanted to cry on the police force? It's a big issue, men crying at work.
And keep in mind, one of the reasons that I wrote the first book is because I wasn't crying as much as I thought, based on how much other people around me were crying. And what I discovered was I was okay for who I was. I was processing my grief internally, and as I discovered the way that it was okay for me to cry, or okay for me to process it. The title of my first book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower.
Yeah.
Because my manliness, my ego, or what I call, not to get religious, edging God out of your life, my ego, EGO, said, number one, I wasn't going to go lay on a couch. And please, I want everyone who wants to seek clinical care to go seek it. I'm just talking about myself, saying, I knew my ego and I knew my manhood. I knew I wasn't going to go, and I knew I wasn't going to openly cry and bawl in front of others. I shed a tear. I choked up like everybody else at the funeral, and my eyes got cloudy, and tears would fall from my eyes. But there's nobody on this phone right now or on this webinar that doesn't know the kind of crying I'm talking about. Everybody knows. I mean, just break down in the fetal position and tell the world, go away. All I want to do right now is cry. I'm not going to do that in front of people. Did I want to? Absolutely. But that inherent manhood, if you will, and please don't get insulted by that, but that manhood ego in me said, you're not going to do that.
But it sounds like, Ron, at first when you said that, you weren't okay with it. Is that true? And then over time you realized it was fine?
That's very true. That's exactly the reason for my first one, was to say, look, I thought I was actually bad because of this. And I'm getting comments from people around me, are you okay? You know, you don't seem to be despondent. You don't seem to be debilitated. You're the father of a child that you said you love so much, and yet you're not breaking down and getting into that fetal position.
And that's so insulting in so many ways, I have to tell you, because
I
remember when I went to my brother's funeral, and it was so overwhelming, and I felt so overwhelmed that I really guarded my feelings. And I remember a friend of mine who really didn't know him, a couple of friends that were crying really hard, and they were judging me, saying, I don't understand, I'm more upset than you are. And I'm thinking, no, that's not true. You just can't see how upset I am.
Hearing what Ron said, you said your first book was Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. I could have probably written one that Sometimes I Scream in the Car. Because whenever I was driving, I could scream. But, I think one thing with men, and I can't speak for women, but it's what you talk about control. So not only do we sometimes think we should be crying, or maybe we're crying too much and not crying enough, but we also feel like we have to be able to control our emotions. And, I tell people I worked in radio as a radio reporter, and, when Ashley died, I couldn't control my emotions. I couldn't stick a microphone in front of a mom who's just, their child had just died and ask them a question any longer. But for us, it's an internal battle almost, isn't it, Ron? Like, well, should I cry? Shouldn't I cry? When should I cry? So we find our places, and that's a great metaphor for it. But a lot of men probably do cry in the shower, or wail, or scream, or do whatever we do. But sometimes we do it in a more controlled way.
Sure. And that's my point is if you're not going to do it in front of somebody else, nobody wants you to change who you are. If your mind is a type like mine, or your brain physiology is a type like mine, where it says, hey, I can't do that, doesn't mean it's right. I'm not condoning it. I just recognize who I was. Then, you know what? Get rid of it the best way you can. And if it's in the car, if it's, I also said that I have a gym where I go in there and work out, and I turn the music up real loud. So if I want to cry along with the really sad songs or sing with the happy ones, nobody knows the difference, because I can't sing, and it all sounds like cats screaming out in the backyard anyway. But that was my way of getting it. And what I'm telling the guys is, look, you've got these emotions, and emotions can't stay inside. Emotions will physically, and I think everyone here will back me on that. If you hold these emotions in, they can physically destroy you. They can back themselves up into your subconscious, where they will act on your behalf without your conscious control and make you an evil, bitter person. So it's like everything else you take into your body, it's got to come back out. If you hold it in there, it really is going to rot you from inside. So find a way to get rid of them.
Yeah, I've got another comment here, and the guy said, hey, I don't see anger on your list. I am mad as hell. My son overdosed, and I am very angry.
Right. And anger comes from what? Anger comes from the feeling of loss. Something has been taken away from him. We're all going to be angry. And if he doesn't do something to work that anger through healthfully, without harming himself or others, if he feels that anger, he needs to dispel that some way, whether it be going and working on the heavy bag, whether it be going out in the backyard and chopping wood, or doing whatever. That anger has got to come out of him. If I can just say anything, it's make sure it's in a healthy manner, and you're not harming yourself or you're harming somebody else. But anger, and I think I'm on the phone with wonderful people who are way above my pay grade on this issue. Anger is a natural human response to things. When we've lost something, especially out of our control, because most of us who have lost have had that taken away without our ability to control it. Alan brought up the control issue a moment ago, which is a huge issue for me. We get angry. And that's an emotion that we can't bottle up inside, because once again, it'll find its way into our subconscious, and it will act on our behalf without our conscious control, and we become an angry, bitter person.
I notice when I go to Compassionate Friends national conferences and meetings, I've done workshops on anger and had men there. It's very difficult. And what I really find down to the basis, when you come right down to it, they're usually angry at themselves that they didn't catch it, or that they didn't see it, or that they didn't do something. They're angry that their wives are hurt.
I see it a lot. And let me tell you, that's one of the most difficult workshops to facilitate. And I've done it as well. But, we're angry because I think, obviously anger is the coming out of something that's below it. And I think at the bottom of it is often fear and lack of control. We have anger for what we couldn't control. And for crying out loud, if I couldn't even keep my own daughter alive, what kind of man am I? And now if I can't keep my family together and my boys are falling apart and I can't keep my job as a radio reporter, what kind of a failure am I? And it's just so many things for most men. It does come back to that. And yes, I was angry too. But anger, the one thing that when I talk about it is, it can be destructive clearly, but it also can be extremely constructive. And just like you talk about, Gloria, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was founded by a very angry woman. And laws get changed by very angry people. And stop signs get put up where children get run over because some very angry person decided to make a change. So a lot of constructive things happen. And I think when we talk about anger openly and honestly and give people tools for how to make it constructive, we're doing a great service to both men and women who have an issue of anger. Now, my wife, when her son Sean died, anger was never an issue for her. So, some people will think there's something wrong with them because they don't feel anger. And that, not everybody is going to, or you may feel it in the future. So, but it's there for a lot of us men.
The anger was fine. It's a very legitimate emotion, as Ron was saying. However, also people really need to be careful because the anger can also wreak havoc on your health and your other relationships. So finding productive ways to release it. And I do like that Ron has some of those.
Nature and nurture and the effects on us has been a hot debate in the psychology world since the 1800s. One camp says that, nature designs who we are and how we respond. The other camp says, it's nurturing, how your parents brought you up, how your coaches and your role models treated you as a kid. And now they've thrown in the white flag and they said, okay, there's a little bit of both nature and nurture in there. We're just not going to agree on how much. But if you look at each, and Heidi was already talking about the big boys don't cry and all the things Daddy taught her. For thousands of years, we have, and in my research, really, we have developed for the sole purpose of survival a number of physiological differences, and survival and for procreation. Just fascinating. We were talking about how women are more prone to come to support groups. And I can take us back into the Serengeti and show you that when man went off for the hunt and was gone for 3 or 4 months, women would gather in groups of other women and children to protect the children while the man was away, and therefore they became more prone to social gatherings. And I think we see that today. And to finish up on that point, because Alan had a point on it, once the men get there, and we all hear this, on Friday they come and say, well, I'm just here to support her. And then by Sunday, they're as well healed as the female is. Yeah. And darn glad they came. But, that's where you get some of this nature versus nurture stuff, is we really look back through time and we see where some of this is really ingrained in who we are and our response mechanisms and our response modes. And real quick, and not to belay this point too much, but we were talking about when a male and female might be talking to each other and one gets aggressive and the female starts to break down, and the male's job is to make sure that she's okay. One of his inherent jobs is to protect her. And when he sees that he can't because she's crying and upset and he can't stop it, we have a tendency as males to become agitated because of that, because we're not doing our job.
I have a question from a woman who says that her husband has a hard time looking at pictures, but she loves to have pictures out on display, and that brought up a broader point to me, because I have people come a lot of times and couples, and they'll say, she wants to go to the cemetery every day. He has a hard time going there. He loves listening to the child's music blared out loud, and the songs are hard for her, and then she likes the pictures, but the pictures bother him. What do you say to couples who may, want different sounds and sights around them and activities? How do they mesh those together? What kind of advice do you give to couples who are in that type of dilemma?
We could give the reason why, and it would be clinical, but the best advice is the one I think we all share, which is going to be awareness and understanding of what the other one can go through. As we talk about the memories and the memory recall, and hopefully the doctors will back me up on this. You know, the hippocampus is the main memory center of the brain, and it's actually larger in the female than it's male, but it goes beyond just the hippocampus, which really assigns memories to long-term memory. So an event becomes a long-term memory and is stored somewhere in your brain. And not to get too clinical, but women have a bigger hippocampus than we are. They can recall memories and often do. I almost say it's almost that curse of being able to replay a loop of a memory over and over in your mind. And they're more prone to go back and take a look at a lot of the emotional things that have gone on with that one that's lost in the male, who will use that part of his brain to move on to that systemizing and organizing and problem solving and not spend so much time on the memories.
It's so true, and it drives men crazy because we keep bringing stuff up from the past or remembering things, and they're like, let's just move forward.
Yeah, the old joke is if the hippocampus were a trailer park, I've got a single wide and you've got a double wide, and it's just not fair. Because you remember stuff from 5 years ago, and we'll start talking about it like we were discussing it 5 minutes ago, and we haven't talked about that in years.
Once a man gets upset, once you get him to that point where he's really upset, it takes 20 minutes for the nervous system to calm down, which women don't have the same issue. So I tell people, one of the things, when you see a man getting upset about something, give him 20 minutes to, let it settle. And because women want to approach men immediately. A woman, Heather, says, okay, so people are angry. How can men get healthy and express their grief then?
If this is addressed towards me, if they're not expressing their grief outwardly, that's not unhealthy. The point to all this is that we're each unique, and we're each, even as male and females, we're each probably going to express our grief differently. Not expressing it, and that's what I went through. I wasn't outwardly crying the way that others were around me. I was still grieving. I was grieving inside, but because we have a propensity as males to be more internal in our processing of emotions, I was doing it in a way that was healthy for me. I didn't understand it at the time, and that's why my advocacy is really to get out there and let both men and women know that you're okay. Just because you're not doing it like Heidi, just because you're not doing it like Alan, doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. You're doing it healthy. And unhealthy, we can give them examples of unhealthy, and I've talked about it a couple times, is poor hygiene, not getting out of bed for 6 months.
Not just danger to yourself, and not just wanting to die, because a lot of times we do after a loss, but having a plan and having access to a plan.
Yes, ma'am. Exactly. So there really is, and I hope I'm not taking her words wrong, because, unhealthy grief is only if we get into some of those areas that are outside of the norm.
But Ron, I think you're making a good point. Even in the complicated grief research, most of what we see is normal. Even though it might feel crazy and look crazy, it's normal. Over 95% of what you see after, 95% of all those grieving, or if not higher, are grieving in a normal way, even though we might not recognize ourselves.
Exactly. And again, I go back to the default thing where I want everybody to know, if you feel that the way you're going through grief is unhealthy, please go seek professional help. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to say that we're not advocating that, but to sit and say that, I think he's unhealthy going through his grief, or am I unhealthy because I'm not crying as much? Take a look at yourself first. Take a look at, are you really doing it wrong? Is there a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it? There are no stages of grief.
And the biggest things that I hear that outsiders that don't understand because they haven't had a loss will say, wow, I can't believe they're still upset. It's already been 2 or 3 years. Sure. It's like, that's not a long time in the world of grief and loss.
Why aren't you over it yet?
Right.
So that's one of the biggest things we hear. But there is no right or wrong for this, only unhealthy. And unhealthy means that, there's a whole litany of things we could talk about which are unhealthy. But for the most of us, I'm not going to cry like you are. Or I might cry and you might not cry. It doesn't mean we're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean that it's unhealthy.
So, Ron, with the many men, the hundreds and thousands of men that you've worked with and talked in front of, et cetera, what helps men? I might be getting ahead of us.
I hate to simplify it so much. Letting them realize that they are okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Honestly, and that's a simple way of putting it. But you're okay, and I'm not telling you to go cry. I'm not trying to change you. I'm trying to let you know, unless you're doing unhealthy things, again, I hate to go back to the default, but unless you're doing unhealthy things, guess what? You're grieving. You've attended a conference. You're not standing still. Just the fact that you're here means I'm willing to move forward. I don't feel like it, but being here on the floor at a Compassionate Friends Conference means, guess what? You're moving forward.
Or just listening to this webinar tonight.
Yes, ma'am. You're right. I'm sorry. Yes,
which I love. I mean, that's why I love the internet, because for those guys out there that don't want to be face to face with people, they can log on and hear you and get support through Compassionate Friends and on the internet.
Sure.
So, Ron, let's talk about this next slide, because I really think it is important. Because can the differences in men and women create problems in a relationship?
I heard it when I had my loss. Probably every couple that I've been in front of have had it whispered in their ear that divorce is always a looming possibility out there, and that a large percentage of men and women who experience child loss are going to get a divorce. And thanks to your organization and some other studies that have been done out there, I think we now know, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the real numbers for divorce for couples that have lost a child is usually in the 13th percentile. And of that 13%, the majority of those had underlying marital problems before the loss, which could have resulted in divorce regardless. I know that Open to Hope has had a wonderful guest on by the name of Harriet Schiff, and there are some people that will go back and point to her book, which was a wonderful book that I highly recommend, The Bereaved Parent. She was such a good writer. She published that book in 1977, and it's still going and going and going, and it's a great book. But in there, she stated that it will create difficulties. She never once said anything about divorce, but somebody glommed onto it. We all glommed onto it. We ran with it. Good, bad, or indifferent for a reason. I'm not sure. But of course there are going to be difficulties. We are opposing as far as our emotions and sexes. And now when we're in that great stressor right after a loss, we're having these struggles with our own emotions that we've never felt before. Nobody prepares for a loss. You can't go get a book and say 6 months from now I'm going to have a loss, I want to prepare for it. And palliative care aside, so I don't mean to touch that subject, but I think you know what I mean. The surprise losses are not preparable.
Right.
So now I'm having a hard enough time dealing with my emotions I've never touched before, and I'm looking at her going, my gosh, I mean, she's juxtaposed to me right now.
The truth is this, it's that it is a myth to say that the divorce rate is higher for families who've lost a child. I believe the divorce rate really, though, it's not any higher, that it may be lower than the national average, but losing a child and the death of a child, there's nothing out there that says that it's the death of your marriage. And I think it's really important for couples to understand that.
People may have gotten divorced anyway. We don't. That's the problem. We don't know whether they had a death of a child or not. And like you said, I've never read any research that shows that divorce is any higher than it is nationally. Just, there's no correlation between the death of a child and a divorce. Nothing that I've ever seen.
Many couples will say that the loss of their child brought them closer together, because as you said, there are these differences. I have a saying, and grief work, to me, is life work. And when Ashley died, I was so blessed and fortunate to have found a 10-week grief program. It was Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who I really like. It was a program that he had created, and I was brought up as real man. You never sought support of any kind for anything, but when Ashley died, that just wasn't possible. But what I've later come to learn is all this immersing myself in the study of grief and loss, and talking to the top professionals, all the way to just the mostly newly bereaved person that walks into a room. It all has taught me that grief work is truly life work. And grief can bring out incredible things in you. It can empower you, and it can empower your marriage. It can strengthen your marriage. But grief also, depending on how you go through grief, it could certainly, just like it could be destructive to your life, it could be destructive to your marriage. And that's why I think the work that you're doing, Ron, is so important, because I think there is a greater need, and I don't like generalization, but I think there is a greater need for many men out there to stop and pause and take a look at how they grieve. Right. To not be afraid to do that, to be willing to be vulnerable, to look at and listen to what your people like yourself are saying.
Well, and I guess, Alan, if there's people out there on tonight's webinar that are concerned about their marriage, and it's certainly understandable because when you're grieving, your spouse is often grieving in a different place and those kind of things. But if you are concerned, seek professional help with somebody that understands grief and loss. And we can help you navigate these waters. And, you know, there's no reason, as you all have said, that you need to get divorced after your child has died. But you might need to have somebody come and help you with this, you know.
Alan had the greatest point, which is the point of love, which is why I think the percentage of divorces is way, 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 way down there, because it's love that holds you through it, and your love actually gets stronger. You become each other's anchors. Yes, you grieve in opposing ways, but at the same time, it's hard to say. It's almost like a feeling to say, but that opposites that are in us for a reason. And even though during those really, really stressful times, those opposites, as long as they're mixed with love, will keep us together. We just have to understand that. We have to get almost to that next point, which is how do we overcome those difficulties? Understanding and awareness, and even self-awareness, because part of this has been about, I don't understand me, am I okay? You've got to dive in and get with people at these conferences, on these webinars, and understand I'm now aware of why I am the way I am, and it makes sense. And guess what, honey? I'm aware of why you are the way you are.
Well, and the reality is 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and I guarantee you the minority of them have the death of a child. Because the death of a child is a very unique thing that doesn't happen to most people. Right.
It's not the natural order of things. But communication, understanding, awareness, there could be no better takeaway from this webinar, in my mind, in my opinion, than just that. Just communicate with each other, is either husband or wife, or brother and sister, father, daughter. This is me, and this is what I'm doing, and I think I'm okay. If I don't think I'm okay, then I'll go find somebody, but let's get through this together.
You can find out about the Compassionate Friends National Conference at compassionatefriends.org. You can find out about the Bereaved Parents of the USA.
It's on our webpage, so you can go Bereaved Parents of the USA, and there will be a link there that talks about the national gathering, and they can go there.
So tell us a little bit about your books and how people can get a hold of you if they want to have you come and speak for them, Ron.
Well, I do have a website out there. It's grievingmen.com. It's been around for quite some time. The books are available through there directly from me, but of course also on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores everywhere. Expensive, and they're from the heart. I have, if I could put anybody out there in the grief community at ease over the books, I have been blessed to form a relationship with Dr. Niemeyer here in Memphis. And the man actually says that my writing style is one of the best that he's seen as far as the non-clinical side of it, for putting out there exactly what the feelings are for men and women.
Ron, it was great having you, and I honor the work you're doing, and thank you for all that you do to help men who are grieving. And Heidi, it's been terrific, and Gloria, it's been terrific having Ron today. Thank all of you for joining us for our webinar. Again, you can find the Compassionate Friends at compassionatefriends.org for grief resources and webinars and radio and television programs. Go to opentohope.com, and you could spend days getting educated and inspired by all the wonderful things that are there. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll be talking to you again soon.